Hello, and welcome to Sound and Image Lab, the Dolby Institute podcast. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today we're wrapping up our special coverage of sound design for video games. My colleague Andy Vaughn once again speaks with some of the biggest innovators in the space. Today, the sound team from Gearbox Software. If you're not familiar with Gearbox, they are known for some of the most famous first-person shooter games, including Duke Nukem and Borderlands series, which once advertised over 1 billion guns in its latest installment, Borderlands 3. So how exactly does a team design the sound for so many different kinds of weaponry? Today, Andy speaks with Gearbox's audio director, Mark Petty, and the associate director of sound design, Brian Fieser, to find out.
Hi, everybody. This is Andy Vaughn with Dolby Games, and today we're joined by the folks from Gearbox. We have both Brian Fieser and Mark Petty with us. Mark, why don't we start with you? Can you tell us where you've been, what you've done, and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, hi, I'm Mark Petty. I'm the audio director for Gearbox Software. I've been with Gearbox in June. It'll be 16 years. My upbringing was in music. I was a music engineer for a lot of years before I got into games. It was kind of happenstance. I had a client that was doing a record, and he happened to be the original audio director for Gearbox. And at the time, they were working on Brothers in Arms, Road to Hill 30, which was the first installment of the original IP for Gearbox. We started talking one day, and he's like, "Hey, I need some sound design help. I know I'd done some TV post stuff in the past." And so I said, "Yeah, that sounds super interesting." So I ended up contracting on that game for 8 months. And it did well, and I left and went back to music. And then in 2006, he ended up going to do other things, and wanted to know if I could get him through a couple of milestones. And so I came in and did that work, and then ended up hiring on as a sound designer, and then just kind of worked through understanding how sort of the production background that I had communicated to games. The thing that was really interesting to me is games just was such a learning curve in terms of implementation and iteration and all those kinds of things. And so it was kind of a cool stepping stone at the time, because I'd been doing music for a long time, and I was kind of looking for something different. So and I really loved playing games. I played Doom and Quake and got really into all that. So yeah, it was just a natural progression. And Gearbox has been a great company. Like I said, I've been with them almost 16 years, and we've built a great team. And yeah, so that's kind of where I've come from.
Quake is a gateway title for both of us, as it turns out, Mark.
Yeah, for sure.
Brian, how about you? How did you get to Gearbox?
Yeah, I got a little bit of a Quake tie-in there as well. It started off kind of in the modding scene, if people remember those days. That's kind of how I got into the industry in general, is just started out doing mods, doing sound design for mods, and that's kind of how I cut my teeth with sound design. And that was like 17, 18 years ago. Back in the Quake 2 days is when I first started that stuff. And I just loved it. You know, it was a hobby of mine, passion of mine. So I just kept plugging away at it, absorbing as much information as I could. And that led to some connections, some mod mates, I guess you could call them, people that worked on the mods with me, getting hired up at a studio that's no longer around called Terminal Reality. And that was my first industry, I guess, on-site industry gig. Started as a sound designer there. I was there for 7.5 years before going to Microsoft. Spent about 3.5 years at Microsoft and 343, and then hopped over to Gearbox, and I've been at Gearbox for 5.5 years now. And I'm currently the associate director of sound design at Gearbox, and it's been a blast. This is like, out of the 18 years that I've been doing this, I'm having the most fun at Gearbox.
Excellent. Well, it's a fun place. We've toured the studio a couple of times now, and I have to say, is a mind-blowing studio you guys have. Can you tell us a little bit about the construction and your main kind of master mix room that you use?
Yeah. So when I originally joined Gearbox, we were in a different building, and in typical fashion, it was kind of makeshift offices that were turned into control rooms. We didn't have a Foley space, except for setting up small little pits or some kind of just recording things in our control room, but just slapping stuff on the wall and putting bass traps in. So when they started to build this building, they were gracious enough to let me get heavily involved in the design of it. Myself and an acoustician named Kevin Hughes kind of put the place together. And it's 6 control rooms that are all exactly the same format. I wanted to make sure that the monitoring environment was 100% consistent across all designers. And then we also built a Foley stage that has 4 pits in it, has visual playback for sync to picture, and that place has really paid off in just huge dividends. The amount of content that we've been able to build over the years for our own personal library and getting away from the commercial libraries as much has been great. I think one of the things that I struggled with early was I really wanted to be able to start from a place of organics. Like I wanted to be able to articulate sound in a way that fit picture. And the only real way to do that was to be able to perform those things live in order to not only get it to articulate with regard to timing and action, but also to have the same sort of dynamics and sound and feel that I think we all wanted as we moved forward. All the rooms are tied together via Dante. During about halfway through Borderlands 3, we took one of the control rooms and converted it to an Atmos room. It's discrete 714. And we started sort of our foray into Atmos with Borderlands 3 and mixed Borderlands 3 and Atmos, and have been working with that format ever since. And it's been an amazing opportunity to just explore the spatial additives that Atmos brings, and the level of detail and the immersion that you can get from it. But Gearbox has been super supportive of audio, and the facility that we've built out. I wish I could just like take the camera and take everybody on a tour, but it's a great facility.
That was one of the things that really impressed me whenever I visited Gearbox. I don't think a lot of studios have the luxury of having the types of facilities that Gearbox does. And even coming from a place like Microsoft where, there are good facilities there. The facilities at Gearbox were on a completely different level, and almost like you could almost tell that like it was built out of like a philosophy of the audio department, right? Like this is a staple. This is a thing that we are going to do and encourage. I was blown away. I had no idea that Gearbox had that, those types of facilities, and just kind of supported that environment.
Yeah, I think we're blown away on our side too. We get to see a lot of studios, but when we walked into yours, we could tell that there was a real dedication to having a space that let you create and build as you wanted to. So it's an amazing room. I wish I could drag everybody with me on the next tour, Mark, but again, can't do that. So we'll just have to talk about it. Well, so, okay. With this dedicated space, you clearly create, as you said, a lot of your own assets and a lot of your own audio clips and files. It seems like that's almost, I won't say a luxury, but that seems like that's a competitive advantage when you're building a game, especially one like yours that, leans on post-apocalyptic themes, and really kind of forces you to look at audio as sounds that don't exist in the real world quite yet. What's that process like?
I mean, there's a couple of different stages, I think, in that process. There are a couple of different beginnings. It could stem from, syncing up with cross-discipline with other departments, designers, creative designers, concept artists, and whatnot, to chat with them just to kind of get a feel and a vibe of what a particular thing might sound like, or like what their intent is behind this thing. And then experimentation, right? Like having the Foley room just right down, a couple of rooms down, you can just get up, walk in there, start playing around, mess with some props, just start recording. And that usually leads to a lot of creative inspiration. In the film world, like a lot of times you don't have the time frame to do that, right? Like you're on a tight timeline. So being able to just experiment and play with new things like that's a lot of the creative process. But in particular for Borderlands 3, I would say looking at things like we treated a lot of the major areas of the games as protagonists, basically. So weapons were characters, right? All the different weapons were characters on their own. And that meant that they all needed their own sort of identity, right? They needed their own signature and sonic palette. And so isolating a particular weapon and breaking it down of like, okay, what is this thing? How does it function, right? Like, how does it even work? It's not a thing that exists in the real world. So you sort of have to be creative and like, okay, well, maybe it has some stuff internally that's, cycling the mechanisms or whatever. You start to build a palette based out of those things, right? Like we'll go with the Hyperions as an example. Like the technology there was supposed to be at its time, like a futuristic technology, but for the timeline of the game, it's more of a, hey, remember when VCRs were the future, right? So it's this like future, but like dated tech. And it was centered around like a lot of sort of construction and power tools, because the lore behind it was that that's how that tech started. It started out as they were using it for construction or mining or something like that. And then it got built into being weaponry, like it got weaponized, right? So we literally started out like recording a bunch of power tools and using, drills, like battery powered drills to take the battery out and put it back in for reload sounds, and just starting out like just building out a big palette and keeping everything consistent within that palette. And we take that approach per manufacturer, so they all sound different, but they all have their like cohesive sort of character across them.
One of the things about the facilities and all of that kind of stuff, like that, the mind share behind it was really about creating a place where neither space nor technology got in the way of creativity, and that doesn't mean that we go out and buy all the gear. What that means is that we wanted rooms that gave you usable and correct information, or as much information as we could get out of them. But also that even adopting Dante and the rooms tying together and being able to record no matter where you are in another space meant that there was enough flexibility there that if people came up with an idea, they could record it in their control room, or they could patch to the Foley room and they could record it there, and being able to collect props over time and all the things that film has been doing a long time. But I think it's a luxury, especially in games, to have those kinds of things at your disposal. A lot of people talk about, well, you build these things because it sounds good. Well, it's not because it sounds good. It's because we want to understand the answers to the questions as quickly as we can. We want to understand the frequency spectrum and the dynamic range and all of those things as quickly as we can, because it makes us faster at our jobs and also makes us more precise at the decisions that we're making to be corrective. It's kind of a building process from the ground up. Having to fight tech, having to fight acoustics, having to fight those things can sometimes really bog down sort of the end point, of just creating good stuff.
One of the things I forgot to mention actually is a part of that process too starts with on paper. Basically, we would build what we called style guides for every single manufacturer, and not just with the weapons. Like we carried that across creatures and enemies and whatnot too. But But writing down on paper, like, building a little chart of like, this is what this thing is, this is what it sounds like, and using descriptors and like, different pieces of creative information there. And then right next to it, this is what it is not, right? This is like, don't do this, don't use these things. That way you can literally line them all up. Like, you can take all the weapons, all the weapon manufacturers, and line up all the style guides right next to each other and like scroll through them and just go, okay, well, this sounds like this thing and it doesn't sound like this thing because this gun has these characteristics, this gun can't, right? So a lot of that process like literally started on paper.
That approach has helped us be able to align a number of designers at a time. Like, everybody has that same documentation to look at, so everybody's on the same page. And to go one step further, getting in early with the palettes and the design documentation, and having those reviews with the creative director of the project itself, as well as people on the weapons team or external teams, has allowed us to be more in sync with what those folks have in their head. Because even though they may not necessarily specialize in audio, like, everybody has sort of an image, of a sound that they're hearing in their head. Sometimes communicating that sound from other departments is hard because they don't do audio speak every day. And being able to put that stuff in front of them in paper format, as well as send them concepts of palettes, even if the asset doesn't exist, just based on art, is a great communication method, because they're able to say, no, man, it just doesn't have enough weight, or I don't hear the sort of rusty mechanics of this, or those kinds of things. Like, it's easier to have those conversations. So it makes the process makes, I think, the game more cohesive in the end, because you don't have as much of a disconnect between the art or the visual and what we do on the audio side.
Yeah, and it also really set us up and put us in a good position. So we had all of the tools and all of the information in front of us to just tackle the sound design. And there was a couple of moments during the development of Borderlands 3 where we had final shippable weapon audio before the art was even final and done, because of that process and that collaboration.
Yeah, well, I'd imagine you had to get an early start on weapons. Borderlands 3 is a game with, is it a billion guns?
Bazillion.
A bazillion guns. So you have a bazillion guns. You have a bazillion different weapons that you have to characterize and make different from each other, and define what they are and what they're not. That seems like it's a gigantic process as you're rolling into a new game. Can you tell me a little bit about how you deal with that quantity of weapon sounds?
I will say one of the things that helped out tremendously, like right from the get-go, was having really good debug tools. And I think that's a thing that gets overlooked, quite a bit in our industry. Like, having the ability to spawn any kind of combination of gun that I want. And like, I can open a menu and literally pick whatever parts that I want to spawn for this gun. Because again, all the guns are built modularly, right? They're all individual separate parts. So if I wanted to open up, the menu and build a Dahl assault rifle with this particular barrel, but this grip and like nothing else, it's a couple of clicks. And then every gun also has a serial number. Like, every build configuration like generates a serial number. So if I want to spawn that again later, I can just copy that serial number, paste it, right, and it spawns. So debugging and being able to generate and spawn whatever kind of combination I wanted on the fly was super useful. Because you're spot on. Like, there's a bazillion guns. There's almost an endless amount of different combinations of audio that can be built and come together, because we do support a sound per part of the weapon. So if there's 3 different barrels for a particular gun, like, there's 3 different at least 3 different sets of sounds that go with those individual barrels. There was a lot of, I think, isolating and dissecting. Well, what do we want this part to do, like, sonically? Like, what is the barrel? What does that do? What does that sound like? And coming up with those definitions, right? Like, so saying like the muzzle is more of your mid to high snap, and your barrel is more of your like low, mid to low thump. And how do those line up, right? In terms of transient, and how do those play against all of the other parts, like the mechanisms that are cycling, like what's the cadence there? So a lot of that starts in the DAW, right? Just building it in the DAW and looking at timing, and building it in a way that accounts for that modularity. Obviously, 10 years ago, it was pretty common to just build a single one-off, like one-shot gunshot that had all of the components built into it. But in a game like Borderlands 3, where we're going with a modular weapon system, like you can't, there's no other way to support that almost endless amount of combinations other than building it in individual little pieces. So it was a big change in mindset and approach that we had to adopt, and also educate the rest of the department on, like, hey, here's how we build guns now, at least for this system anyway. But at the end of the day, like there, I don't think that there was any other way to get around it, right? And to support that sort of like a system like that.
I mean, and that philosophy, because of the way that Borderlands is built, that philosophy of modularity expanded past weapons. We used it for projectiles and explosions and those types of things. It creates more dynamics and a greater set of variation without having to commit to canned buckets of content. Instead of creating 27 one shots of a gunshot, you can create 4 or 5 variations of these individual parts, and then they just mix and match and play. And we can control them through RTPCs to define volume and pitch and those kinds of things. So those are also working in the background to sort of help with the freshness of every time somebody grabs a mod or grabs a weapon, or that weapon upgrades. So yeah, it worked out to be kind of the perfect solution for that style of game.
The amount of time you spend shooting weapons in a Borderlands game, it's a lot, right? Like, and shooting a lot. So it kind of like Mark was saying, like it adds an amount of variation, which cuts back in the repetition. If we were to just design, a canned one-shot sound for, like a Jacob's pistol or something, and then that's, you only heard that subset of sounds, like those 5 sounds, regardless of what combination of parts you had for that Jacob's pistol, that would get pretty repetitive, right? With the amount of times that you're shooting your weapon. So it's a way to like always kind of keep it fresh, and like every time you pick up a gun, like it sounds a little bit different. Some of the differences might be a little subtle, like Mark was saying, just shifting RTPCs around to like maybe make it sound a little more accurate or something.
You smell like death. Come closer. Here we go.
Hope you know what you're in for, gunslinger.
But it's a freshness, right? Like it's avoiding the repetition. Like you pick up a new gun, it sounds different. Pick up a new gun, sounds different. And that's kind of the core loop of the Borderlands games, like promotion of always picking up new loot. Like we want you to grab some new guns because new stuff is spawning all the time. So it's almost an incentive, right, to try a new gun out. Just the sonic experience and the sonic presence of it.
Gotcha. Well, a bazillion. It's still stuck in my head. Though that gun shoot must have been, again, long stare inducing. But that must have been a whole different way to approach a gun shoot, to know that you were going into that many different sounds for weapons in this game. Were you able to reuse past recording efforts, or did you go in fresh and just record everything new?
It was a combination. I mean, honestly, the godsend was the fact that we have a good set of field recording gear internally anyway, and we live in Texas, so there's lots of people with lots of guns and lots of places, lots of space. So outside of the formal gun shoots that we did, which was really only one large formal gun shoot, we did a whole lot of like side shoots here locally, just us. And some of that was experimentation, some of that was filling holes. We kind of were learning as we were going about where we needed more content, where we needed different types of content, different perspectives, different tales, those kinds of things. And we would go out and do those shoots. It was funny because for the Foley end of the weapons, we ended up just sending out an internal email blast and said, hey, like anybody who has guns or is a sort of a gun enthusiast, we're going to be recording Foley. And we expected to get a couple of email responses. We got like over 50. And we did like 2 to 3 weeks worth of solid, just 8-hour day recordings of people bringing in their weapons, breach, clip, dry fires, all sorts of things, handling. So we built a huge library of gun Foley out of that. But a lot of it was kind of just internally sourced. We even took those folks out and did some shoots on our own with them. And it was an amazing learning experience for us because it enabled us to take the knowledge that we had gained from the first shoot and move it to the second shoot, make adjustments as we went, to the point to where we became much more adept at recording weapons. And because they're hard, I think out of anything to record, like weapons are super hard to record. And not only from the actual mic placement and the technical of the shoot itself, but also the post-processing and understanding how to deal with background noise and all the other things that play a part, in those shoots. But yeah, it was an ongoing process all the way through.
Yeah, and that big response that we got actually let us be selective, right? And then it kind of went back to the style guides that we had written. So like looking at a Jacobs as an example, like it being like your, quote unquote, Western style gun where it's woods and metals. With that turnout of weaponry, we were able to go, oh, okay, like, well, this individual has, these 3 to 5 guns, and like they fit the description that we wrote up of the Jacobs, right? They have this like, Westerny sort of feel to them. They're heavier, they're bigger metals, wood, and like hammers that cock back and stuff like that. So we got to, sort of categorize these weapons into buckets that fit what the manufacturer style guides were that we had written up. And then we took that same approach, the sort of call to arms email that Mark was describing. We took that same approach to supplement the weapons with other things like the Hyperion. They have a big servo type of presence, and that's a big part of their characters. When you reload a Hyperion, like you can hear the servo winding and like recharging the magazine and pulling it, back into the magwell. So same thing, like we send an email out like, hey, we're looking for like servo-y small motor things. Does anyone have like cameras or old cameras or, whatever? Like we would send out some descriptions of what we're looking for. And same thing, like got a big overwhelming response. People started bringing in all of their stuff that they thought, maybe sounded servo-y or had a small motor in it. And I still remember this one. This was probably one of the most unique ones. Is there somebody had a self-cleaning litter box for a cat, gently used, and but it actually had a great servo sound to it. And that was a way for us to help share our craft with the rest of the company and help educate them a little bit on what we do, because we would bring them into the Foley room, right, with their litter box or whatever it was, and have them perform it a couple of times just to show them like, this is what we do. Like, this is how we capture content, and this is why. And yeah, so we took that approach across, more things than just weapons. That was a lot of fun.
Please tell me that person got a game credit, like name Litterbox.
The cat did.
Good enough. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, all I was going to say is, it was, I can't say enough about what that process did for just, I guess, taking audio, which sometimes is a black box to other disciplines and folks within the games space, and opening their eyes and opening sort of opportunities there. And I think people were just super excited about understanding more and about what we do, and also being a part of that. Even if it is like, hey, that's my litter box, when you're playing the game, like those things are fun. So it's going even one step further, like that creates somewhat of a sort of mind share with the rest of the studio, to where when they're creating their assets, they don't feel like there is that barrier between them and audio. Like they're like, oh, well, I worked with those guys on this thing. Like, I wonder if they'd do this thing, and they'll reach out and we'll have conversations about that. Like it's just it's a more unified effort, and it's great to get everybody involved in that outside of audio.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear. When you speak to audio teams, you commonly hear that audio comes last in the game, and it can feel like an afterthought, or it comes after plot and character. But it seems like this is a way to break down that barrier between teams and get them to think about the audio as they're building the game. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Brian and I have been working on that sort of model for a long time, and it's baby steps. You keep including people. You may not work with the same person twice, but you keep looping people in and bringing people into the fold, and over time, it becomes a culture. And that culture is really what we're trying to create. We're trying to create a place where people understand more about audio and are excited about audio. And when they're making those paper designs, when I'm an artist, I'm making this paper design, and I'm putting these drawings together and getting all the documentation. Maybe that person now, because they were involved in that Foley recording, maybe they're thinking about audio more. Maybe they're thinking about ideas about audio. Maybe it breaks down the barrier of them reaching out, and also helps them to understand that there are no stupid ideas. And just because you're not an audio person, like, we want your feedback. We want to understand what you hear in your head, because it's important that vision is as much part of yours as it is ours. So that level of inclusion spurs that all of that communication to happen earlier, and it's it grows every time, every game, every title, and we just keep pushing forward.
Yeah, and it's working. Literally last week, I had a concept artist send me a message and said, "Hey, I was boiling a pot of water for some rice, and it was creaking and kind of groaning, which that's a little weird. That's never happened to me before when I boiled rice." But nonetheless, shot me a message and said it sounded to me almost like a submarine, like underwater, maybe decompressing or something. And this person actually recorded with their phone, right? That's fine. Recorded the sound of it, sent it my way, and then they also went the extra mile to grab some free audio software and pitched it down just to be like, this is what I was like creatively hearing when I say submarine underwater. And like, it does. It sounds like a submarine kind of like groaning, but that's sort of proof that what we're doing is catching on. And it's getting them to think in that sort of creative space. I would have been impressed, alone just by that sort of creative and critical thinking of sound, just sitting there listening to the pot of boiling water like that. That's impressive enough, let alone recording it with their phone, right, to send my way. But it just sort of shows that like the approach that we're taking here is catching on. And it's becoming super beneficial for us, but also like the rest of the company, right? Cross discipline. This was a concept artist, right? That was doing this. So, in turn, like now when they're sketching, right, and they're thinking up visual ideas for a thing, like they also now have audio in mind, and that's going to benefit us, down the line.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a path to a better game when everybody at least understands the mission of each team and can contribute as they're creating. It probably gives you a better style guide at the end, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So because they're in that headspace now, right? So they can almost talk the audio lingo, so to speak.
Gotcha. Well, okay. We spent a lot of time on guns. I'll see if I can get off of those now. Let's talk a little bit about the environment. You have, a unique environment in the Borderlands franchise. That cel-shaded look, that gigantic open world that takes you into really crazy and unexpected places. That's a lot of ambience to manage. How do you deal with that?
A lot of at least in the Borderlands franchise, it's always been probably the forefront of that presentation has been more musically based in terms of mix and things like that. And we've always worked with the composers to make sure that the style guides and the communication is about environment and about the creatures that are involved in those environments. Whether that be distilled down to things like, hey, this is all like green, organic, and lush, or this feels like a swamp, or this feels very high tech, like using those as just the high level bullet points and then moving down from there. But when it comes to sound design, we always look for opportunities to bring things forward, push things back within that musicscape. Whether that be rain on different surfaces, or we have a system that understands where all the trees are and can take and place birds in those trees at height appropriate level, and looking for those level of details just to sort of creep in and be just a part of that soundscape with music. We're working on new systems to revise those things because we want a greater level of detail, especially as everybody pushes into more of sort of open environments and more open world, more places to explore, like being a part of that from a sound design perspective. Because you can't, at that point, with that amount of time to wander around, trying to support that with static music over time, it gets redundant, and it's hard to create freshness and spontaneity and dynamics that way, at least for us. So yeah, it's really about sort of picking our moments or it has been picking our moments and understanding where we want music forward, where we want music back, where we want sound design in, where we want sound design out. And because there's so much combat in Borderlands 2, it takes some of that focus away from the environment. Because it's heavy gunplay, heavy call-outs, lots of dialogue, those kinds of things.
Yeah, you mentioned dialogue. There's a story behind every character in the game too, and it seems like that's a fundamentally important part of gameplay, understanding who these characters are, where they're coming from, and where they stand in this landscape of chaos. Again, there's a lot of competition for the audio elements in that game. Do you deal with those differently now? Have you changed the way you deal with that competition between dialogue and combat in Borderlands?
As we've moved forward, even from Borderlands 3, like we've started looking at sort of the culture or the philosophy that we were talking about before, becoming better embedded with narrative and having those conversations about mostly moments that are happening where dialogue may play while a moment is happening. With sound design, is that the composition or the arrangement we want of that scene? Do we want to delay the dialogue by X or play the dialogue before to let that moment happen? Really about storytelling. How do we want to tell that story? Should it be 100% narrative? Should it be in that moment 100% sound design? What does the player want to hear, and what sort of achieves the goal the best that we can and the cleanest that we can? Because it can get cluttered. It can get cluttered at times.
No, I mean, I think Mark nailed it with everything he said. A lot of it is, that delicate dance of timing and cadence. And it can be a struggle, at times, with the amount of dialogue that plays and different types of dialogue, right? There's, all of the combat stuff and then the narrative stuff to tell the story and push the story along. And then there's little, side pieces like the echo logs that you can collect and whatnot. So, some of it is about treating that dialogue against itself, like against each other, the different, levels of dialogue. Like how do we treat the narrative stuff that like is being fed directly to you and into your head, and how do we process that versus like the battle stuff that's happening out on the battlefield versus like, oh, I picked up like an echo log, and so what does that sound like? And so approaching those creatively with a little bit taking a little bit a different approach to those creatively, I think helps sort of make it feel a little bit less just everything's dialogue all the time, which translates better into the mix across the board in general.
Got you. You mentioned feeding a lot of this directly into people's heads, and it's one of those things that we're wrestling with on this side too. That competition between open play, open audio in your room, like audio off of your television or off of your home theater system versus headphones as well. How much does that have a bearing on how you design going in, or do you design separately for both of those endpoints?
No, we don't. We don't design differently. I will say that the since we started mixing in 714 on Borderlands 3, we started to change sort of our approach to content creation in the sense that it's no longer the typical let's think about this in the horizontal plane because it will only always play there, be that headphones or left, right, or even 5.1 or 7.1. With the addition of heights, like it begs the question of now should we record ambiences in binaural, whether that be quad or up second order. What about weapon tails? What about birds? What about environmental sounds? What about rain? What about like how should we adjust? Not because the intent is to always play those things in 714 or have heights, but to give ourselves the flexibility to be able to have discrete content. Because ultimately what kills things is having to upmix all the time and you run into phase issues. Not having that discrete information for the channels causes all sorts of things when you start to fold down. So I think that's the biggest thing that has been an adjustment for us in looking at headphones. And I mentioned headphones because even though there's the Atmos headphone renderer and the other DSP-based sort of spatialization renderers out there for headphones, still like that content, if it feels out of place and discrete, like it's not going to fold down well. So thinking about things from a different way when we're designing, and for that matter, training the other designers to think a different way when they're looking to record content and looking to put content together. Is this a shield sound that happens once in the game, and when you grab that shield, it creates this bubble and it envelops you? Well, if that happens, like maybe we should do something there to support the height information. Maybe there's a way to break that down, but that starts at the content creation level. Like originally, I think for Borderlands 3, because we got Atmos later, we weren't thinking in that vein as much, and it became more about mix issues and ways to dissect and move things around in the post-production phase. But again, like I think that the best way to communicate those things is to start with the content creation itself.
Okay. It sounds like you still are thinking all the way through the game, what does the player need to hear? And no matter how they're playing, it's really a challenge to figure out the most important piece of information to put in front of them. How do you make that decision?
I mean, there's so many variables there. Like, is it a sound that the player hears 1,000 times during the game? Is it is it a sound that the player only hears once? What kind of information does this communicate? Is it on the critical path, and is it something that is critical for the player to understand? And that changes not only the approach to how it's mixed, but how it's created. Obviously, if it's something that plays 1,000 times, like, you don't want that thing to be to feel redundant over time and feel fatiguing. So maybe that sound is a little more rounded or smaller in size. Something that is cuts through the mix really well, but is somewhat inconspicuous with regard to just the way that it approaches you every time. It's something that you hear, but it's not something that's fatiguing. And it's really about game design. A lot of those guys will dictate, hey, this is truly an important system. This is a truly important piece of information. How do we support that? And we do run through the same process with that as we do with weapons or anything else. Like, we sit down, we talk about the UI, we talk about how we want to approach it, what that needs to feel like. Is it fantasy based? Is it sci-fi based? Is it more mechanical? Is it hard transient? Is it soft and pillowy? All those descriptors go into those design approaches, and then we start putting in temp content based upon that from the palettes, and looking at that and reviewing that and seeing, as we're playing, even looking at other things, like what sticks out to you, what feels arduous over time. I think that part of it, the HUD and UI stuff, is one of the harder things because of the fact that it is often repetitive. Like, you can't really give variation because it's obviously got to be something iconic that they know when that fires, it means this. So it's kind of something that happens. Well, it's not kind of, it is. It's something that happens over the course of time throughout the entire development cycle.
Yeah, and there's I think a layer too of not only like what is the most important piece of information for the player at the time, but also what do we want the player to feel in this moment, and asking ourselves those questions, and delivering that response is difficult. And like there's some hard lessons learned from just Borderlands 3 that we've carried into Wonderlands, trying to correct those lessons. And an example of that would be, like Mark was saying with the repetition, right? When you take damage, initially in Borderlands 3, like, we wanted that to be sort of a visceral experience, right? We wanted the player to feel in danger. And so we sold the response to that sonically, by doing a sort of system, like a tiered system of damage sounds. So like, tiny, small, medium, large, huge. And it would scale versus, based off of various conditions and whatnot. But when you took a lot of damage, we wanted you to feel it. Like, we wanted the player to feel in danger and vulnerable. And we pushed that sonically. Now, lesson learned, is when you get towards the end of the game, right? Like, post game, like, you've already finished the game, you're playing it through a second time. Your character, the level that you're at, is completely different than the level that you started at, right? You're no longer a level 1 character where, taking a lot of damage might be a big deal. Like, you've got a lot of, experience and a lot of health and shield and everything. So you might be in a situation where you're taking a lot of damage all the time. We ran into that. So, and what the side effect of that was that, when we're pushing this sound sonically, and like, we want the player to feel this, and then you're feeling it all the time in the post game world. That was definitely a lesson learned, where we're like, okay, we, something that we maybe didn't completely think all the way through to the end. What's a lesson that we can take away from that, so we can either A, fix it and correct it in a patch, or B, carry it into our next projects.
Gaia. Okay, well, you talk about the carryaways here. It takes a very long time to build a video game. As a Borderlands 3 player, I definitely feel it when I'm taking a lot of damage, and that's always memorable to me in this game. But to you guys, you spent forever building this content. What are some of the most memorable bits to you? What's a scene that you still love? What's a sound you still love? It can be as small as the cat box, I'd imagine, or as big as, the way an entire room sounds.
Honestly, they always crack me up in BL3. The speak and spell stuff that we did for the weapons that when you have to reload it, you throw the weapon and it hits the ground, it bounces, and it does an ow, 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 ow. Like stuff like that to me always cracked me up, and I loved that presentation. It was super fun. Outside of that, man, there's so many like small things that speak to me throughout the game. Which is one of the things that I enjoy about that franchise is it's oftentimes not about something that's necessarily a single moment and iconic as much as it is just about a flavor. You know what I mean? Just a little layer that sits on top that moves through the world when you're shooting a weapon or interacting with something. That was the first thing that came to mind, though.
Brian, you got a favorite in the list, or are you still kind of combing through the thousands out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a blur, right? There's so much stuff. There's so much content in that game, and so much good content too. That I feel like a lot of the content that I'm actually thinking of currently is centered in the Wonderlands universe versus the Borderlands 3 universe. I do like, kind of like Mark was mentioning, the sort of like, you can go from having this really visceral, serious experience in Borderlands 3 to all of a sudden hearing, a speak and spell say ow or hey or something like that. Or, crying as you throw it away. And so it's always toying with your emotions, right? Like you go in this moment of like, I'm in combat and like everything is super serious, and like, oh, okay, now it's funny. So it's always a sort of like up and down. And an example of that, I remember playing one of the beginning levels, right? Just running through and just sort of doing some testing and listening to the updates sonically, and shooting one of the skag pups. Actually made a puppy like yelping sound, and I was like, ooh, my heart, like it like got me a little bit, because I'm a dog person, and like hearing that puppy cry, I was like, oh, I kind of feel bad for it, but now I don't, because there's 30 of them trying to eat my face. That was it was such a small sound, but like it played to me, it hit me in the feels.
Gotcha. Well, it's incredibly effective. Again, as a player, I think that the moments of humor and the moments of hitting me in the feels are both, pretty important to me in playing that game, and it keeps it alive for me. So I think, to kind of wrap things up, I think it's an amazing game. I think you guys have done amazing work. I'm looking forward to what you do next. And I'd imagine you'll bring as much humor and as much character to the next title. Yeah,
we're excited about Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. That's going to be a lot of fun. I've had a lot of fun playing it during development. I found myself, while trying to do sort of reviews and take notes, forgetting that I'm supposed to be taking notes because I just got into the game and it was fun to play. And of course, then it's like, oh crap, now I have to go back and replay the last 2 hours. But it's a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun making that game. We changed the palettes up some to be more fantasy, to move away from the sci-fi aspects of Borderlands. So I'm super interested to get it out in front of the fans and the public and see how they feel about it.
Yeah, you want to talk about the as a sound designer, right, getting to work on Borderlands 3, where it's sci-fi, but it has this like, blend of comedy, to where you can do things like embed, the screams of babies into your explosions, right? Like be creative that way. And yeah, like a sound designer's dream, vehicles and guns and like monsters and creatures and explosions. Like you almost feel like it can't really get any better than that. And then we step into this whole different realm with Wonderlands, where it's very fantasy and magical and whimsical. And then looking back and going like, well, that I thought Borderlands 3 was like the sound designer's dream, and now I get to do all this cool stuff with magic. It's just like icing on the cake. But it did present, I think, some challenges. Like Mark was saying, like we had to completely change our approach and the aesthetic and the palette, because it's a different universe, right? It's still, within the Borderlands IP and all that, but sonically it's, it has to be different, it has to feel different. The things that we did on Borderlands 3 don't necessarily translate sonically and in terms of tone over to Wonderlands. So we had to start from scratch there. But yeah, it was a ton of fun to work on. A lot of different and new techniques, sound design techniques that a lot of us really haven't gotten a lot of time to play with before. So, sort of flexing those muscles a little bit and exercising that creativity has been a blast.
Guys, I'm fascinated with the stuff you're telling me about Wonderlands. I expect another Gearbox game with the same Gearbox personality, with the same humor and the same hit me in the feels that you talked about, Brian. Tell me, when should we be looking for Wonderlands?
Wonderlands should be out, I believe, March 25th of 2022. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. We're excited to get it out there and get it in front of fans.
Well, we can't wait to see it. Brian, Mark, thank you both for joining us, and we're looking forward to seeing your upcoming work.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Andy. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been a blast.
Thank you once again, Andy, and thanks to the folks at Gearbox for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed our coverage of sound for video games, and we hope to bring you more of these kind of conversations in the future. But for now, we're turning our attention back to Hollywood. And it's a little hard to believe, I know, but it is already award season once again. So we're going to be taking the next few weeks to pull together some interviews for our 2022 Academy Awards coverage. We'll be focusing on some of our favorite categories once again: Best Sound, Best Cinematography, and Best Animated Feature. So before you fill out your Oscar ballot, make sure you're subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. As always, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts by searching for Dolby. So we'll see you in a few weeks. Until then, thanks again for joining us. This is Sound and Image Lab, brought to you by the Dolby Institute. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with production support by Taylor Hines. And our production coordinator is Sunny Chen. Thank you for listening.